Hi there. Here I continue looking at the Holy Bible verse by verse. This is number 11 in the series, so you have some catching up to do if this is your first. This video will take us from Genesis chapter 5 through the flood stories to the end of chapter 8. Genesis chapter 5 is the Toledot, or generations of Adam, detailing the lineage of Adam through Seth to Noah. Wiser intellects than me have attributed this chapter to the priestly source, i.e. a later addition to the Pentateuch, of which more anon. This chapter is at first glance simply a list of begats and not very interesting, but a couple of comments are worth making. I should quickly mention Enoch in Seth's line, who is said to have lived a short time on earth. Where the other patriarchs are all bouncing along for between 895 and 962 years, Enoch gets just 365 before apparently being whisked away by God. 365 cannot be a coincidental number, but its significance is lost in history. I would now ask you to consider how Adam's lineage through Seth to Noah compares with the lineage of Cain. It must surely be more than coincidence that the two branches of Adam's tree are so similar. Cain is the evil brother who killed Abel, and Seth is the son born to replace Abel, apparently 130 years after that first murder and fratricide were committed. Is it reasonable to think that Seth's descendants would be so eager and willing to name their offspring after the offspring of Cain? Is it reasonable to think that the list of Seth's descendants would mirror so closely those of Cain's? Remember that these names were considered very important to the writers of the Bible. Adam's descendants through Seth to Noah are the antediluvian patriarchs, the fathers of all living men. So what are we to make of all these similarities? Is it possible that two sources are being used here, two separate patriarchal lineages? The Cain and Abel story in chapter 4 is an old J-source document with Yahweh as the God, but it should be noted that 4:25, where Seth is introduced, has Elohim as the God. This is indicative of the later P or priestly source, and is considered by many to be the starting point of the priestly flood narrative, with its Adam to Noah genealogy supplanting the original Canaanite genealogy. A quick aside. It should be obvious to anyone reading the Pentateuch that it has multiple sources. The documentary hypothesis was developed during the 18th and 19th century, and this concluded that the Pentateuch had four sources: J or Jahwist, E or Elohist, P or priestly, and D or Deuteronomist. This view held through much of the 20th century, but is now much debated. The debate ranges from those who hold that the original hypothesis is fairly sound, to those who claim that Moses wrote everything down in 40 days on Mount Sinai. I'm no scholar of Hebrew and do not pretend to be able to argue the points here. Wikipedia has a good introduction to the documentary hypothesis with plenty of references for you to research. And if you can't spend any money, Bacon's Genesis of Genesis, Bibles within the Bible, is freely available online, and you might want to start there. References as always in the description box. I shall simply continue to highlight aspects of the Bible text where it is reasonable to conclude that a change in style/authorship/source takes place. Having said that, let me continue. We know that the Bible has very little interest in women, other than as possessions, vats for fermenting profits in, and someone to blame for all of life's ills. Yet Cain has three women mentioned among his descendants: Adah, Zillah, and Naamah. This would suggest that these women were very significant at one time, perhaps in a story that was lost, perhaps in an origin story that was replaced when Seth's genealogy was inserted to usurp Cain's and demote him to the role of evil. That's probably enough on something which I can only offer conjecture about. I will end by mentioning that Adam and Enosh were synonyms in the original Hebrew. If we add that little factor into the mix, it would take very little to collapse these two family trees into one. And so on to the flood. Now I appreciate that most of you will have seen this covered multiple times, and so I'm not going to cover ground which has been well trodden, but hopefully highlight a few things you may not have noticed from previous readings of the flood narrative. So let me start with the first 4 verses of chapter 6, which I think stand alone, and in addition to that, verse 3 appears out of place amongst the 4. Chapter 6 verse 3 is a Yahweh verse, J verse. The other verses appear connected and are Elohim verses. There are several key phrases. Sons of God, or Ben Elohim. In the Ugaritic texts, Ben Elohim were the 70 sons of Asherah and El. Asherah is an ancient mother goddess and appears in texts as far back as Sumerian. She would take a video of her own, which may come. I'll try to remember to put some references in, which also link Asherah to possibly being the wife of Yahweh. Apologists have suggested that sons of God referred to the good guys, i.e. descendants of Seth, and daughters of men referred to the bad girls, i.e. descendants of Cain, but this is nowhere supported in the text. The daughters are described as fair, meaning good, in the original Hebrew. Would the daughters of Cain be so described? Now, there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that. Nephilim are mentioned just twice in the Bible, which causes the literalists a little bit of a problem. How did they survive the flood? When the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. Bear in mind that no mention is made of the Nephilim again before the flood, which kills all life on the planet. So these mighty men, men of renown, what renown? They sound like they deserve at least a chapter of their own to cover their mighty renowned exploits, but the Bible is completely silent about them. Nephilim and giants are mentioned after the flood, and it would make sense that these few verses are to explain their origin, but the intercession of the flood would prevent any possibility of a connection between the two, you would think. So how did Moses come across a race of giants in Numbers 13:33 when God had destroyed all life in the flood? So verses 1, 2 and 4 appear to invoke some great mythology, and certainly meant something significant to the man who wrote them down, but to us they must remain enigmatic. Having dealt with the first 4 verses of chapter 6, I shall now leap through to the end of chapter 8. It's widely accepted and pretty obvious that the flood myth is actually 2 interwoven stories, with additional patching and editing. But 2 threads can be quite easily seen. The first considered by many to be the older Yahwist source, and the other the later priestly source. So I'll just make a few comments on the flood story, which no amount of creationist invention can ever elevate above the mythologized story of a local event. We have seen that the sons of God were on the earth, carrying off good human girls and raping them. And we have seen that God did absolutely nothing about the behaviour of his sons, angels, demigods, giants, whatever these Nephilim were. He never stopped it. Do you think if, in Narnia land for a moment, this kind of thing was really happening, that the humans in the area would have every right to get seriously pissed off about it? And maybe say, screw you gods, if this is how you behave? Perhaps the men would start misbehaving themselves, in direct mimicry of the behaviour of the divine beings they were witnessing. Perhaps if God had got the shit in his own house in order first, rather than implementing a do as we say and not as we do policy, he would have garnered a bit of respect from his subjects, because he would have deserved some respect. And he would then have found no reason for wiping every single living creature off the face of the earth, because they would not have misbehaved. Now, it rains for 40 days and 40 nights. In Cardiff they call that summer. And after the 40 days and 40 nights, Noah opens the window and sends out a dove, which contradicts the 5 months plus 5 months plus 2 months, could that be exactly 1 year, stated in the other version. I should also mention that this deluge, which raised the Himalayas, separated the continents and carved the Grand Canyon, also apparently left an olive grove intact. Though who trained the dove to bring back leaves, it doesn't say. I'll finish by saying that good old God stays true to form. Wiping every living thing off the planet was not enough for him. And as if Noah's job was not hard enough, making an ark big enough to fit so many animals on, then rounding up all those animals, he also had to make room on that ark, and feed, water, and muck out an additional pair of every clean animal that ever there was, simply so that immediately he made landfall, he could slaughter them all and burn them, just to satisfy God's bloodlust. Does that make sense to anyone? And that's the end of the flood. Thanks for watching.